Good to be back here with you all. I've been on vacation over the last 2 weeks. I got to go to Manitoba and visit some family, and it's the first time in like the last 4 times that I went back to Manitoba that I wasn't sick, so that was a big win and really nice to be able to enjoy that time there. So growing up, I was a pretty sheltered kid. And a lot of it was just due to my own choices and kind of personality. All my friends I had growing up were Christians. I wasn't really interested in going to parties or smoking or doing drugs or even associating with people who had foul language. And then after I finished high school, I went to Bible school, so more of the same kind of atmosphere. And then after my first year of Bible school, I got a job doing stucco in Winnipeg. And it was kind of a culture shock. I was on a crew that was mainly Romanians and Croatians at first. There was one guy from Mexico and one white guy newbie like me. And I didn't understand a lot of what was being talked about, but I remember them passing around a phone with some unsavory things on it. And thankfully they didn't include me, but it was tough because I had absolutely no idea how to interact with these people. And because not only did they speak a different language, but I had avoided people, basically, I avoided people who weren't Christians most of my life. And then I moved crews, and I was the only one on the crew who didn't do tobacco in some form. And it was on construction that I got well acquainted with the smell of a certain drug, and lots of language. And so it was a big shift for me to go from avoiding people who aren't Christians to now my coworkers are smoking alcoholic druggies, and I spend more time with them than I do anybody else. So today we're going to look at one of the more well-known stories in the Bible, the story of Jonah. We're going to look at chapter 1 today, so you can turn there in your Bibles. We'll start by reading verses 1 and 2. So this story, most of us have heard of it, but hopefully we'll be able to look at it with some fresh eyes this morning. It's such a small book that you miss it. Hosea, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah. There we go. Jonah, chapter 1, we're going to read verses 1 and 2 to start. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." So I'll start just a little bit of background. So likely we all know of Jonah or have heard of Jonah because of this book, but Jonah was likely just another prophet in Israel before this incident happened. In 2 Kings 14, verse 25, we read that this same Jonah, the son of Amittai, had prophesied to King Jeroboam II. So Jonah was a well-respected man of God. So you can imagine when we talk about Jonah, kind of like a well-known pastor, Christian leader. Now these verses, we read that Jonah was told, "Go to Nineveh." Now, Nineveh doesn't really mean much to us today, but people in that day would have known Nineveh well. So Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, and it was kind of like the superpower in that area. So I have a couple maps for us here that kind of show us Assyria. So that orangey part there is kind of the land of Assyria. So we're going to go 3 maps from 900 to about 800 BC. So you can see their territory is growing. And then in this third map is important because you'll see their territory is pretty big, but right in the bottom here, there is a city called Samaria that we know from history that they attacked. Now, at this time, Samaria had belonged to Israel sometimes, but at this time was being controlled by a leader named Hazael of Aram. And he took lots of land from Israel. So you can show the next slide. So the Bible tells us in 2 Kings 10, verse 32, that in those days the Lord began to reduce the size of Israel Hazael overpowered the Israelites throughout their territory. So Hazael is, or I'll use this. This guy is kicking King Jehu's butt all over the place. They're losing land like crazy. So this is 32 years before we know Jonah was a prophet to King Jeroboam II. So likely, when this top portion is happening, Jonah was probably a kid. So we don't have any mention of this in the Bible. Go to the next slide. This is part of something called the Black Obelisk. So if you go to the Royal British Museum in London, you will see this thing. It's like a big rock thing that has a bunch of sides, and it has pictures on it. And on it, it has this picture. So it's one of the only instances that we hear of a king of Israel from outside of the Bible. But on it, it says that, so this is the king of Assyria who wrote it, I received the tribute of Jehu, son of Omri, silver, gold, golden bowl, etc., etc. So what likely happened was King Jehu was getting kicked, it was getting absolutely crushed by Hazael of Aram, and then Assyria comes and wipes out Hazael, and Israel went, oh crap, we are going to lose very badly. So just like kind of imagine if Saskatchewan and Manitoba were at war, and Saskatchewan was losing lots of territory, and then the United States came and wiped out Manitoba. Like, we would go, oh shoot, and well, let's give them lots and lots and lots of money so they don't attack us. It's kind of what happens here. So when Jonah was young, Assyria comes, just about wipes them out, and thankfully they leave after they paid them off. But what likely Jonah would have grown up knowing and hearing about was how unbelievably cruel the Assyrians were, right? Nations around them would have experienced that, and so people talk, and he would have grown up hearing about these Assyrians and how bad they were. The Assyrians, their favorite pastime was committing war crimes. Like, they were unbelievably brutal people. So let's look back at verses 1 and 2, and we'll talk about it a little more. So, now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. Now, I want to read that, especially this verse 2, right? God basically tells Jonah to go and warn Nineveh. Kind of, the wording is a little bit weird and awkward, but as a parent, it's pretty common that you'll warn your kids, right? You might warn your kid, hey, don't touch the stove, you'll get burned, you'll get an owie. Or you might warn them, hey, don't hit your brother, because if you do, you'll get a consequence. But why do we warn people? Ultimately because we want them to be aware that their actions have consequences, and we don't really want them to experience those consequences, right? Now, as a kid, when you hear your parent warn you, depending on the context, you can kind of get a sense that it's almost like your parents are like being mean because they're warning you. But in reality, right, parents aren't like, ha 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 ha, I get to administer consequences today. Right? And the same thing with God. God isn't excited looking for opportunities to administer consequences. We love our kids, we want them to avoid harm, and so warning them communicates to them that we care about them. We love them, right? We all would feel hurt if we weren't warned about something, right? For example, if someone brought you a drink and doesn't warn you, hey, it's hot, and then you drink it and you burn yourself, you'd be like, what? Like, why didn't you care about me enough to warn me that I was going to burn myself on this? Warning communicates that you care about someone, that you love them. So God tells Jonah, go and warn Nineveh. So God is telling a Jewish prophet, a man who speaks and is part of God's chosen people, hey, I care about these horrible, evil people over here, and as my messenger, I want you to tell them. Like, that would shock us, that would have shocked Jonah, that God loves the Ninevites. Like imagine being told by God to go and talk to Putin or North Korea or ISIS about God. It would kind of be similar for us. Because this is not like go tell your kind and generous neighbor across the street about God. This is go and talk to some of the worst human beings who are walking the earth at this point. And the implied message from God is go talk to them because I love them and I don't want them to receive the consequences that are coming their way. Now, I'm sure, or you may have heard people joke, and I'm sure I have at times as well, joke about like, well, if there's a place that you never want to go or a job that you never want to do, like be careful because that's probably what God's going to ask you to do. Kind of like, oh, I hate Indian food and hot climates, and well, God, with this sense of humor, is probably going to tell me to go be a missionary in India. And there are situations where that happens, but we can get this image like God enjoys getting us to do things that we don't want to do, that we don't enjoy doing, or almost like God enjoys watching us suffer, which is not true at all, right? God is love, and everything he does is good. And so he does call us sometimes to do things that are scary or intimidating, but he's not doing it just because he enjoys watching us suffer. He does it because he cares for others, and also he cares for us. And in his plan, this is what's best for us to do. He calls us to do scary things because he loves us. So he's calling Jonah here to Nineveh because he loves the Ninevites, but also because he actually loves Jonah. And we'll see throughout this book that Jonah has some major flaws. Despite the fact that he's this great spiritual leader in Israel, he's got some major flaws, and God calling him to Nineveh is actually for his good as well. So now let's look at Jonah's response, verse 3. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. So God tells Jonah, rise and go to Nineveh. So Jonah rises and goes to Tarshish. And by the way, Tarshish is in southern Spain, so about as far as you can get. So the way the writer sets it up is kind of humorous and ironic, and there's lots of parts of this book that are that way. But the reason we're told that Jonah fled was to flee from the presence of the Lord. Now, we know that God is in control of everything. Right? There's a famous psalm, Psalm 139, that talks about there's nowhere in this world that we can go where God isn't. And Jonah would have known that psalm. And to add a little bit more to confusion, later on in this chapter, Jonah says that God has made everything and is kind of in control of everything. So it's confusing, because if Jonah believes that, then why does it say he's running for the presence of the Lord? An explanation I found was that Jonah was rejecting what God called him to do. Basically, Jonah is saying, God, I will not serve you or do what you say. Kind of like he was running from relationship with God. Now, I grew up watching VeggieTales, and there's a VeggieTales movie about Jonah, and where Jonah doesn't want to go to Nineveh because Nineveh's full of fish slappers, and he's scared of being slapped by fish. And I've often heard the story of Jonah told like he was scared he was going to get hurt or lose his life, and that's why he didn't want to go to Nineveh. And that may partly be the case, right? But that is never mentioned in this book as a reason why Jonah didn't want to go there. And we'll see later on in the book, we are told clearly why Jonah didn't want to go. But fear of physical harm was not the main reason Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh. So we may look down on Jonah for running away, because clearly his priorities are different than the priorities of God. And I think we would all like to believe that if God came and clearly told us, hey, go and do this, that we would obey right away. But I think in reality, we act like Jonah quite often. Right? There are groups of people that Christians are known to dislike, to hate. People that are that we often tend to condemn and avoid rather than communicate the gospel to. Like, I just think of my stucco crew full of sinners. Had I met them, any of them, before working with them, I would have avoided them like strongly. I would have not have gone anywhere near them. When we see sinful people, do we first think of them as people in need of God, people that God has specially commissioned us to go and minister to? Or do we think to ourselves, wow, look at that dirty druggie, or that scummy sleazebag, or that woke weirdo, or whatever derogatory name you want to label somebody as? Because the reality is that God has told each of us to rise up, go, and tell people about Jesus. Teach them and baptize them. And sadly, I think that often we're just like Jonah and say, you know what, God? I'll pass on telling those people. Let's look at verses 4 and 6. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship, and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish. So our guy Jonah is running from God, what God has told him to do, and it seems like he thinks he's gotten away with it, right? Maybe he didn't think that God actually cared about the Ninevites that much, and he would let him go once he saw that, Jonah really doesn't want to talk to them, right? So he's sleeping on a boat, and then everybody on the boat recognizes that God is at work, except for Jonah, right? The prophet of God. The sailors, who are from likely different countries around, are all praying to their gods, doing everything they can to survive, and it takes the pagan captain to tell Jonah to pray. Jonah, the man of God, needs to be woken up by a pagan sailor and told to pray. So Jonah's running has caused him to ignore and to miss what God is doing, and he's the last to realize it. Let's read verses 7 to 9. And they said to one another, Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come up upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you? And he said to them, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. So essentially, they roll the dice to see whose fault it was, which must have been fun, right, in a boat that's rocking and windy and stormy to try and do that. But somehow they figure out that Jonah's their guy. And it just shows us a little bit more of Jonah's character. So imagine they're in the middle of this huge divine storm, trying to figure out why this is happening, like winds ripping, waves are crashing, and Jonah just sits there, doesn't say anything. Right? Like the moment he woke up, he could have been like, oh, shoot, sorry guys, this is my fault, here's what we need to do. But as they're trying to figure out why this is happening, he just sits there and waits, and I'm guessing he hopes he gets lucky and they think it's somebody else's fault. Right? Like, Jonah, what are you doing? Like, you could solve this, but you're not. So after they figure out that it's Jonah, they ask him, like, whose fault is this? They ask, what's your job? Where are you from? So Jonah answers them, and I almost imagine Jonah, like, puffed out his chest a little bit, and he answered, like, I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. The sea that we're in is my God's in control of that, so, and I'm follow him, which sets off alarm bells in our head, like, Jonah, if that's what you believe, then what are you doing? Like, if you believe that God is in control of the water, and you're in the water, why do you think you can run away from him? But this made me wonder, how often have I done something similar? where I freely confess, no, I'm a Christian, I follow God, I serve him, but my actions don't show that at all? Right, how many times have we said, like, oh, God's in control, and then worried and stressed about what tomorrow was going to bring? Or said that we love God and then participated in activities where our words and actions were the opposite of loving? It's quite ridiculous for Jonah to say, I fear God and I serve God at this moment, but we have likely all done similar things. Let's continue reading verses 10 to 13. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, what is this you have done? For the men knew that he was fleeing for the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then he said to him, what shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us? For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you, for I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. So the sailors are freaked right out because this God is clearly powerful, and he's coming after Jonah, who's on their boat. But these pagans, they don't know God. They've never served him. They don't know what pleases him. And so they ask Jonah, what do we do? And he tells them to throw him overboard. Now, note that Jonah doesn't say, God says, throw me overboard. Now, this is a little bit speculative, but it's very possible that Jonah's mind went something like this. If I drown, then the Ninevites don't get to be warned about what's coming, and God will have to punish them. Almost like he had exhausted all his other options, and now this was his last-ditch effort to make sure that the Ninevites don't get warned, to make sure that they get punished. And it's curious, too, like, why does Jonah make the fishermen throw him off? Like, why doesn't he just jump off the boat? You don't actually have an answer, but it kind of seems like Jonah's a coward. So the sailors, they hear what Jonah says, and they see that God's power that's happening, So the sailors hear that, and we can see that the sailors are taken aback by how powerful that God is, because they do everything they can to try and save Jonah's life. Now, at first, I thought the sailors were rowing to land because they thought they could escape God too, but I don't think that's the case. They were likely very scared of God and thought, if we kill this guy who's following God, that God is going to get mad at us and come after us. So they try and, we'll just get Jonah off, and then God can deal with him there, and we'll go on our merry way. Except they can't. They can't get to shore. So it's kind of like they've run out of all other options. And then they get to verse 14. Therefore, they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood for you. O Lord, you have done what you pleased. So, the first people in this whole account that we see talking to God, that we see praying, are these pagan sailors. Like, we know Jonah was told to pray, but we don't actually have any record of him doing that. And the sailors, they have a beautiful prayer. It's humble, it's submissive. They're essentially telling God, God, please don't hold us accountable for what we're about to do. We don't want to do this. You've initiated this, and so we're going to pass Jonah off to you, and you can deal with him. And then they do what they were told to do. They throw Jonah overboard. And it just strikes me that, where is Jonah during all of this, during the rowing? These men they're getting no direction, no help from the one man who actually knows God. Jonah seems like he's perfectly okay watching these guys flounder. He's no interest in helping out and intervening. Read verses 15 and 16. So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. So they pick up Jonah, they chuck him in the ocean, and then the sea calms down after that. Now, the thing that I find incredible is that this book was written by Jonah, or Jonah told someone who wrote it down. So when verse 16 is happening, Jonah is sinking down to the bottom of the ocean. So he would not have seen this happen. So the only options are either God divinely told Jonah, which is possible, but I think more likely that these pagan sailors recognized that God was the one true God, returned to Israel, and worshipped him, and maybe even became part of God's people. And what makes that more likely is it says they offered vows and sacrifices. Right? The men just chucked everything extra they had on board off the ship. So they didn't have extra things to sacrifice to God. So very likely, these pagan sailors were turned, or through the action of God, went back to Jerusalem and started following him, which is amazing. So it's like, not only did Jonah miss that God loved the Ninevites, when Jonah was passively staring at all these sailors, he also missed that God loved these men too. So Jonah, he's running away. He doesn't do what God has told him, and yet we can see that God is in control and still uses Jonah's disobedience for his purposes. And it's encouraging because we see God's patient love for Jonah too. God chases after Jonah, not because he's like, come here, you little twerp, I'm going to make you do what I say. That's not God's heart. He's chasing after Jonah to call him back to himself. Right? So that brings up the question, though, like, are we like Jonah? Do we care about the lost like God does? I started out this sermon talking about my old construction crew. So in my second year of doing stucco, I was part of a really rough crew. My boss got a DUI early on, so I had to drive my boss to work. I know a few of the guys were part of gangs. Drugs were smoked regularly at work. Foul language was the norm. But the amazing thing was that God moved in my heart so that these people who I would have normally run away from became friends and people who I cared for. And then I went back to Bible school the winter after that, and printed out all their names on a piece of paper and prayed for them regularly throughout my year. Their names were Ted, Lawless, James, Jay, and Gil. The amazing thing was that I was able to have some really good conversations with them about God, and in the years since then, a few of them have messaged me and asked me to pray for them and just thanked me for being, I guess, who I was. I don't say that to toot my own horn, but to say that God can do amazing things if we are willing. That's the other thing I think that's awesome about this book. God didn't pick a willing participant. Right? God could have picked someone who's like, absolutely, I'll go and do that. You got it, God. And gone and done it, would have happened, easy peasy. God chose a prophet who he knew was going to say no. It's encouraging because I know that I'm not great at following God all the time. And yet God is patient and says, no, I'm still going to work with you. So if God can work through Moses, he can work through you. So I'd encourage you to think of who are the people in your life that you do not share God's heart for. Or maybe it's a neighbor who just seems like he's a jerk, or a coworker who seems to enjoy making your life miserable, family member, a kid at school. Maybe it's a group like LGBTQ or whatever you have it. And we may say like, oh, I care about those people still, but do we actually love them like God loves them, or do we merely tolerate them? Like, do we care enough to sacrifice things for them to go out like Jonah and go all the way to this far land? Because I fear that in my own life, I am often like Jonah. That I take for granted that I'm part of God's people, and I let the fact that God has worked in my life to do good fill me with pride like I'm better than other people. And I would rather stay and enjoy my nice life than go and tell others that they're loved by God. Because the reality is that, like Jonah, God has told us to go into a sinful world and warn them, to tell them about him. Because the amazing thing is that Jesus died for us while we were yet sinners. Jesus died for us when we were still like Nineveh. while we rebelled and hated God, he died for us. So we are no different than the worst of sinners. We are all sinners in need of the grace of God. And so we have the privilege of leading others to the same one who has saved us and brought us life, both now and forever after this. So today we're going to celebrate that fact by taking communion together, by remembering what God has done for us, that he didn't just see us as terrible sinners, but came and lived on this earth to die for our sins. So we have 3 stations. There's one there, one here, and one in the back. There's gluten-free wafer thingies in the back. So you guys, in a moment, we can get up and go and grab juice and bread, and then we'll take communion together. Let's take a moment to remember the amazing love and patience that God shows for us when he died, and the continued amazing grace that God has for us, just like he has for Jonah. So you guys are free to go and grab that and think about what God has done, and then we will partake together.